She almost didn't notice it. The moving company had come and gone. The boxes were stacked against the wall of the kitchen with the granite countertops, the stainless steel appliances, the wide window that faced west toward the Danvers River. It was October 2008. The light that afternoon came in at that particular New England angle, low and amber, the kind that makes everything look like it's already a memory. She was walking the perimeter of the building with the realtor's brochure still folded in her coat pocket, doing what new homeowners do, learning the seams of a place, the places where the plaster shows its age, the doors that stick. The cornerstone was set into the exterior wall near the north entrance. Gray granite. The letters had been cut deep into the stone, deep enough that a century of Massachusetts winters hadn't softened them at all. State Lunatic Hospital, 1874. She put her hand on it. The stone was cold in a way that had nothing to do with October. The building she had just purchased a condominium inside, the building with the harbor views and the recessed lighting and the in-unit washer and dryer that the listing had specifically emphasized, had been, for 114 years, a psychiatric institution. The hallway outside her door had been a ward, the large windows in her living room, the ones she had specifically asked about during the showing, had been designed not for resale value, but because a doctor in 1874 believed that sunlight could cure madness. She stood at the cornerstone for a long time. This is a story about what gets built on top of what we'd rather not remember. It's a story about a man who genuinely believed that a building could heal a broken mind, and about what happens when an idea that beautiful runs headlong into a world that doesn't have the patience for beautiful ideas. It's about 2,000 patients sleeping in hallways designed for 600. It's about a woman named Margaret who walked into Danvers State Hospital in 1947 and didn't walk out the same person. And it's about the question that the woman at the cornerstone carried with her up to her apartment that October evening and has never fully put down. Can a building hold what happened inside it? I want to start with Thomas Kirkbride, because without him, none of this exists in quite the same way. Kirkbride was a Quaker from Pennsylvania, which matters. Not as biographical trivia, but because the Quaker tradition of moral treatment, the idea that the mentally ill deserved dignity and structured calm rather than chains and darkness, ran through everything he built. He was a physician at the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in the 1840s, and what he saw there disturbed him in the specific, productive way that things disturb people who are about to devote their lives to changing them. He saw patients chained to walls. He saw men and women locked in basement cells so damp that the stone wept. He smelled the wards before he entered them. That particular institutional smell of unwashed bodies, of straw that had gone too long between changes, of something underneath all of it that he later described in his notes only as despair given physical form. He sat with that smell. He didn't look away from it. What Kirkbride believed, and what he published in 1854 in his treatise on the construction, organization, and general arrangements of hospitals for the insane, was that environment was treatment. Not a precondition for treatment, treatment itself. Fresh air, natural light, gentle exercise, proximity to beauty, these were not amenities. They were medicine. The architecture was the intervention. His plan was specific to a degree that bordered on obsessive. The building had to be situated on high ground, so patients could see distances. The wards had to be arranged in a staggered bat-wing pattern. 2 long wings extending from a central administration building, so that every room received direct sunlight at some point during the day. Hallways had to be wide enough for groups of patients to walk together. Ceilings had to be high. Ventilation had to be cross-directional. There had to be farmland, gardens. The patients were meant to work the land and eat what they grew. There had to be a library, music rooms, parlors where patients could sit with visitors and feel for an hour like people whose lives had not been entirely surrendered. He was not sentimental about mental illness. He understood it as a physical condition of the brain, treatable through physical means. But his definition of physical means was vast enough to include beauty. And that is where he was radical. By 1860, his plan had been adopted, in whole or in modified form, by 73 institutions across the United States and Canada. These were called Kirkbride buildings. There was a Kirkbride in Ohio, in Indiana, in New Jersey, in Tennessee. Each one was meant to be a machine for healing. Each one sat on a hill. Each one pointed its long wings at the sun. The one in Danvers, Massachusetts opened on May 28, 1878. The architect was Nathaniel Bradley. He was 51 years old that spring, a Boston man, a professional with a reputation for institutional buildings, schools, hospitals, custom houses. He had designed the building over the course of several years, working directly from Kirkbride specifications, and the drawings he produced were, by any honest account, extraordinary. If you have ever looked at the original Bradley blueprints for Danvers State Hospital, and I spent 3 days in the Massachusetts State Archives doing exactly that. What strikes you first is not the scale, though the scale is significant. What strikes you is the care. The hallways are drawn with their widths annotated in Bradley's own handwriting, sufficient for 2 invalid chairs to pass. The window placements are noted with compass orientations. He drew the views. In the corner of one sheet, he sketched what a patient in Ward D, Building 7, would see when they looked east on a clear morning: a slope of grass descending to a tree line, and beyond the tree line, the suggestion of hills. He drew the view because the view was part of the design. He believed in it. That matters. Nathaniel Bradley was not a man drawing a warehouse for inconvenient people. He was drawing a place where broken minds might, given time and light and the right kind of quiet, find their way back to themselves. The morning Danvers opened, the local newspaper ran a description of the building that used the word noble 3 times. The Board of State Charities reported that the structure represented the most enlightened thinking in the field of mental medicine. The first superintendent, Dr. John Ordronaux, walked the wards with a journalist from the Boston Globe and said, this is a direct quote from the Globe's July 1878 issue, "We have built not a prison, but a garden. The patient who enters here enters as a patient, and we intend that they shall leave as a recovered person." The hallways smelled of fresh paint and pine. The windows were spotless. Light moved across the floors in long rectangles that shifted as the day progressed, so that if you sat in the day room of Ward C and paid attention, you could track the hours by the angle of the light on the wall. 42 patients arrived in the first 2 weeks. Most had been transferred from the State Lunatic Hospital at Taunton, and several of them, according to the intake logs that survive in the Danvers Historical Society's collection, had never been outside in years. A patient identified in the logs only as EEH, female, age 34, melancholia, is noted to have stood at the window of her room for 47 consecutive minutes on her first morning. The staff note reads, "Patient appears calmer than upon admission, interested in the grounds." 47 minutes at a window. That is the Kirkbride vision, compressed to its essence. A woman who had been in darkness, standing in light, and something in her body responding to it in a way the doctors of 1878 were just beginning to understand, and that we still, honestly, don't fully understand today. For roughly the first decade, Danvers functioned more or less as designed. Patient populations stayed near the intended capacity. The farm produced enough food that the kitchen smelled, on good days, of actual cooking: bread, roasted meat, the particular sweetness of corn in late summer. Patients worked in the gardens. There were dances on Saturday evenings in the central hall, the music provided by a patient orchestra. The superintendent's annual reports from the 1880s are, reading them now, almost painful in their optimism. Recovery rates are cited. Patients are described returning to families, to employment, to ordinary life. There is a letter in the Danvers Historical Society collection, dated September 1883, written by a former patient to the superintendent. The patient signs herself only M.T. She writes, "I am well. I am working in my brother's shop in Lynn. I think of the garden at Danvers more than I can say. I hope the roses by the east wall are still flowering." She was writing to tell them the garden had done something that she couldn't name, but could feel. She was trying to say thank you for the roses. The roses were still there. For a while. The trouble started, as it usually does in American institutional history, not with malice, but with numbers. Massachusetts had a problem. The state's population was growing faster than its capacity to house the people that population produced who were unable, for whatever reason, and the reasons were wide and often shockingly mundane, to care for themselves. Mental illness in the late 19th century was a category that absorbed grief, poverty, alcoholism, epilepsy, what we would now call depression and anxiety, and PTSD, and, critically, behaviors that powerful people found inconvenient in less powerful people. Immigrants who spoke no English and couldn't communicate with intake physicians. Women whose husbands found them difficult. Elderly people whose families couldn't afford to keep them. Men broken by industrial accidents and wars. All of them came to Danvers, and Danvers, designed for 600 patients, kept accepting them. By 1890, the patient population was 736. By 1900, it was over 1,100. The 1905 annual report of the State Board of Insanity noted, in language that reads today with a certain appalling blandness, that the institution continues to operate above designed capacity, and steps are being taken to address crowding concerns. The steps taken were to add buildings. The back campus filled in across the 1890s and early 1900s with additional wards, a new infirmary, an attendant dormitory. Each addition was built without Kirkbride specifications. The wings no longer pointed at the sun. The hallways narrowed, the ceilings dropped. The buildings were not machines for healing. They were machines for storage. By 1923, Danvers held 2,364 patients in a building designed for 600. I want you to hold that number for a moment. 2,364 in a space built for 600. That is not a slight miscalculation. That is a different institution entirely. That is a different moral universe wearing the same building's face. The wide hallways of Bradley's design. Those hallways he had annotated sufficient for 2 invalid chairs to pass. The hallways that were supposed to allow patients to walk together in small groups, to have something approximating a corridor of human society. Those hallways were now lined with cots. There was no other place for the cots. The day rooms, designed as social spaces, as the places where patients would sit in armchairs and look at the hills and occasionally feel like people, were now sleeping rooms for the overflow. The farm fields were still being worked, but the produce was going to feed not 600 mouths, but 2,364. And the math didn't work, and the food showed it. The windows were barred now. The original specifications had called for windows without bars, because Kirkbride believed that barred windows sent patients a message about themselves, a message that the architecture of healing was specifically designed to not send. But with overcrowding came danger. With danger came bars. The windows still let in light, but the light now came through iron, and the iron made shadows, and the shadows fell across the cots in the hallways in parallel lines, like something out of a photograph you don't want to look at too long. The smell had changed too. Bradley's ventilation system, the cross-directional airflow, the high ceilings designed to let bad air rise and fresh air cycle through, could not function as designed when every room held 3 times the bodies it was built for. The wards in the older buildings smelled of close-packed human habitation in a way that was, according to a 1924 state inspection report, not conducive to patient recovery, and indeed, likely counterproductive to same. The inspector wrote that sentence, and then the state did not reduce admissions by a single patient. They allocated funds for a new boiler. Nathaniel Bradley had died in 1888. Thomas Kirkbride had died in 1883. Neither of them lived to see what their idea had become. There is something almost merciful in that. The medical treatments that arrived at Danvers through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s were not the product of malice. I want to be clear about that, because the easy narrative, monsters in white coats torturing the helpless, is not only inaccurate, but dangerous, because it lets the system off the hook. The psychiatrists at Danvers were responding to genuine desperation with the tools their profession gave them. The tools happened to be catastrophic. But they were the tools the profession endorsed, the tools that appeared in the journals, the tools that were demonstrated at conferences and written up in respectably printed monographs with footnotes and citations and the imprimatur of serious institutions. That is what makes it complicated. That is why the system is the villain rather than any single doctor. Because individual doctors inside a system that validates catastrophic tools are, in a very precise sense, doing their jobs. Hydrotherapy arrived in the 1920s. Patients who were agitated, and there were many agitated patients in a severely overcrowded institution with inadequate staff, were placed in tubs of water at controlled temperatures for hours at a time. Prolonged warm baths were believed to have a sedating effect on the nervous system. Cold baths were used for other presentations. The hydrotherapy ward at Danvers held rows of ceramic tubs, white and clinical, with canvas covers that could be secured over the patient so only their head was exposed. A patient could lie in a tub for 4 to 8 hours. Some patients found it calming. Some patients found it unbearable. The staff recorded the hours. They did not always record what the patient said about it. What the attendants who worked the hydrotherapy ward in the 1930s experienced is something I've tried to reconstruct from the fragmentary record that survives. A 1936 internal review of the Danvers hydrotherapy program, requested by the superintendent after a patient died of hypothermia following a cold pack treatment, includes brief, almost reluctant interview notes from 3 ward attendants. One of them, a man who had worked at Danvers for 9 years and who was identified only by his initials, R.L., said the following when asked whether he believed the treatment was beneficial. "I believe it quiets them. Whether that's the same as helping them, I couldn't say." R.L. had been performing this treatment 5 days a week for 9 years. He quietly did not know if it was helping anyone. He kept doing it because the treatment schedule said to do it, because the physicians had ordered it, because stopping would have required a moral clarity about the gap between quiets them and helps them that the institution, not R.L. personally, but the institution, did not have the structural capacity to accommodate. He kept doing it. The patients in the tubs could hear the ward around them. They could hear the canvas covers being adjusted on the tubs nearby. They could hear the attendants' footsteps on the tile floor, which was always damp and smelled of the particular minerality of institutional water. Chlorine, and something older than chlorine, something that came from the pipes themselves, from the building's age. They could hear the building settle in the cold. They could hear other patients through the closed ward door down the hallway. Danvers was never silent. An institution housing 2,000 people is a continuous low register of human sound. Voices, footsteps, the metallic clank of trays, someone somewhere always crying or laughing or talking to no one in particular. And the hydrotherapy ward held that sound in the way the tubs held water. Insulin shock therapy came in the mid-1930s, brought to American psychiatry by Manfred Sakel. The principle was straightforward, and the execution was terrifying. Inject a patient with enough insulin to drive their blood sugar to near zero, inducing a hypoglycemic coma, then revive them with glucose. Do this repeatedly, over weeks or months, on the theory that the coma somehow reset whatever in the brain had gone wrong. The evidence for this was, at the time of its adoption, minimal. The risk of death from the procedure was not minimal. At institutions across Massachusetts, including Danvers, insulin coma therapy was administered to hundreds of patients through the late 1930s and into the 1940s. The Danvers patient register for 1939 lists 47 patients receiving insulin shock that year. 8 of them died of complications. 8 of them died of the treatment. Their deaths were recorded as cardiac arrest or respiratory failure, or in 3 cases, simply natural causes. Not one death certificate in those 8 cases mentioned insulin shock therapy as a contributing factor. I spent an afternoon in the Massachusetts Vital Records Archive with those 8 death certificates spread across a research table, reading them in the particular flat light of a records room, fluorescent, without mercy, the kind of light that makes everything look like evidence. The certificates were standard forms. The handwriting in the cause of death fields was neat, professional. The handwriting of people who had filled out hundreds of these forms and knew the language that the forms expected. Cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, natural causes. None of it was technically wrong. The hearts had stopped. The lungs had failed. The cause of all of those things, 9 weeks of medically induced coma, was not mentioned, because mentioning it would have required the institution to acknowledge a chain of causality that the institution was not, in 1939, prepared to acknowledge. The families of those 8 patients received the death certificates. They were told that their family member had died of natural causes. Some of them may have suspected otherwise. None of them had the documentation to prove otherwise, because the documentation was in a file in a building they were not allowed to enter, written in clinical language. They were not trained to read. Signed by physicians who answered to a state institution, that answered to a state government, that answered to a budget. There is a name in the Danvers death register for October 1939, Clara Weston, female, 41, schizophrenia. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. She had been at Danvers for 6 years. She had 2 children, aged 14 and 11. I found her admission papers. Her diagnosis had been made after she spent 3 weeks not leaving her house and refusing to speak to her husband. 3 weeks of silence. And then Danvers. And then 6 years. And then October 1939 and a form with cardiac arrest in neat handwriting. I don't know if Clara Weston was one of the 8 who died of insulin shock that year. The records don't connect the 2 sets of documents directly. She might have died of an unrelated cardiac event. The records are incomplete in the specific way that records become incomplete when an institution has an interest in their incompleteness. That uncertainty, that deliberate institutional gap between what happened and what was written down, is itself part of the history. The gap is the evidence. Margaret Ward arrived at Danvers on a Tuesday in March of 1947. She was 34 years old. She had brown hair going gray at the temples, a gap between her front 2 teeth that she'd had since childhood, and hands roughened from years of work. She'd grown up in Lowell, worked in the Mill District, married at 22. Her commitment papers, which I read in the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health Archives, list her diagnosis as psychoneurosis, hysterical type, with paranoid features. The clinical justification for this diagnosis, as recorded by the admitting physician, was as follows. Margaret had, over the course of several months, repeatedly accused her husband of conducting an affair. She had argued with him at volume in their apartment building. She had, on 2 occasions, left the family home without informing him of her destination and returned the following day. She had told her sister that she intended to leave the marriage. He signed the commitment papers. Her brother-in-law, a physician, co-signed. A judge approved the order without interviewing Margaret. She walked into Danvers on a Tuesday in March, carrying a brown cardboard suitcase with a broken latch held shut with twine. She wore a wool coat that had been her mother's. At intake, the nurse noted her physical condition as good and her affect as agitated. She told the intake nurse, "I am not sick. I am angry. Those are different things." The nurse wrote, "Paranoid ideation evident" in the log. Margaret Ward was assigned to Ward C, Building 7. Her room, and she did have a room, a small one, which was something, given the overcrowding, had a window. The window faced east. On clear mornings, if she stood at the right angle, she could see the slope of grass and the tree line that Nathaniel Bradley had sketched into the corner of his blueprint 69 years before. She stood at that window. She waited. She wrote letters. The first 2 years, she wrote letters every week to her sister, to her mother, to a friend from Lowell named Dolores. Some of those letters were delivered. The ones the staff deemed appropriate in content were mailed. The others were placed in her file, where I read them 76 years later, still in their unsealed envelopes, still addressed in her careful, slightly left-leaning handwriting. Her sister visited twice in 1947, once in 1948. After that, the visitor log for Margaret Ward goes silent. In the letters from 1947 and 1948, Margaret is furious. The fury is organized, articulate, specific. She names the nurses by name and describes their behavior with precision. She describes the ward routine with the eye of someone cataloging evidence. She writes to her sister, "Bring a lawyer. Not to get me out immediately, because I know how that looks, but to establish that there is a record. Someone needs to know the record." She writes to Dolores, "They give us pills at night. I don't know what they are. I hold mine under my tongue and spit them out when the nurse isn't watching. I need to stay sharp." She was staying sharp. She knew exactly what had happened to her. The letters from 1950 are different. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of change you'd notice if you read one letter and then the next. But reading the 1947 letters and the 1950 letters back to back, the difference is audible in a way that has nothing to do with handwriting or vocabulary. The sentences in 1950 are shorter. The fury is still there, but it's banked now, like coals rather than flame. She writes to her mother, "I am still here. The spring is coming. The tulips by the east fence are starting." She was writing about the tulips. The years accumulate in the files. 1951, 1953, 1955. The letters get shorter. The intervals between them grow longer. The specific fury, the names of nurses, the legal strategy, the request for a lawyer, fades. Not because she was being broken in any dramatic or sudden way, but because Danvers was a machine that ran on repetition, and repetition is patient, and Margaret had been repeating the same cycle. Write, wait, be disappointed, repeat, for 8 years. And 8 years of that particular kind of repetition does something to a person that a single dramatic act of cruelty could never do. This is what institutions do. Not always with a procedure. Sometimes just with time. The man who brought the procedure to Massachusetts was Walter Freeman. He deserves a close look, because Freeman is one of those historical figures who resists simple villainous framing, not because he wasn't responsible for enormous suffering, but because he genuinely believed in what he was doing, and because his story illuminates something essential about how medicine can become harm while wearing the face of progress. Freeman was a neurologist, not a psychiatrist, which is one of the details that his critics have always seized on. He had become obsessed in the early 1940s with the work of Antonio Egas Moniz, the Portuguese neurologist who had developed the leucotomy, a surgical procedure that severed connections in the prefrontal cortex, and who had received the Nobel Prize for it in 1949, a fact that was and remains one of the more uncomfortable entries in Nobel Prize history. Freeman developed his own version, the transorbital lobotomy, which required no surgical theater, no general anesthesia, and no surgical training. He used an instrument that looked like an ice pick, inserted it above the patient's eyeball into the orbit of the eye, tapped it with a small mallet through the thin bone at the top of the socket, and then manipulated it to sever the frontal lobe connections. The whole procedure took under 10 minutes. He called it a minor operation. He performed it in his office. He performed it in state hospital wards across the country in a tour that he himself called the lobotomy tour, driving a vehicle he called the lobotomobile, pulling up to state hospitals and demonstrating his technique on dozens of patients in a single day. He was not a fraud. He was not hiding. He published his work. He presented at conferences. He wrote papers with titles like Transorbital Lobotomy, a 10-year follow-up, and the result of prefrontal leucotomy in 200 cases. He documented everything. The documentation is the most disturbing part. His patient notes describe patients who were agitated before the procedure and calm afterward. Patients who were aggressive and became manageable. He used the word improved, the way other doctors used the word cured. In his framework, a patient who had been fighting and screaming and insisting on their release, a patient like Margaret Ward, and who after the procedure sat quietly and looked out the window without speaking, had been improved. Freeman presented his work at medical conferences and was received, at least through the late 1940s, with something that was not quite enthusiasm but was not rejection either. The psychiatric profession in 1948 was a profession without many effective tools. Antipsychotic medications did not yet exist. Talk therapy was available, but was widely considered impractical for the severely ill patient population housed in overcrowded state institutions. You could not do psychoanalysis with 2,000 patients. What existed was physical intervention, hydrotherapy, insulin shock, and now the lobotomy. Freeman offered a procedure that was fast, that required no surgical theater, that could be performed by a physician who was not a surgeon, and that produced, in a significant percentage of cases, a patient who stopped fighting. The stopping of fighting was interpreted as improvement. This is the mechanism I want you to understand, because it is the mechanism that drove Margaret Ward toward Ward C, Building 7, toward the fall of 1952. Not the malice of a single bad doctor. Not the sadism of a specific institution. The mechanism was, a system under intolerable pressure selects for interventions that relieve the pressure, and the intervention that most reliably relieved pressure at Danvers in 1952 was removing the capacity for resistance. The women who insisted they didn't belong there, who were, in many cases, entirely correct that they didn't belong there, were the ones who generated the most pressure. They were the ones most likely to be identified as candidates for more aggressive treatment. The very accuracy of their self-assessment was used as evidence of their pathology. Margaret Ward wrote in a letter in 1951, "They tell me that my certainty that I am sane is itself a symptom of my illness. Dr. Harmon told me this directly. He said that patients with my presentation typically believe themselves to be the only rational person in the room. I told him that in my experience, the rational person in the room is almost always the one who has noticed something that no one else wants to acknowledge. He wrote something in his notepad. She was 38 years old when she wrote that. She had been at Danvers for 4 years. She was still sharp enough to understand the epistemological trap she was in. the trap where insisting on your sanity becomes evidence of your insanity, and to articulate it with precision, and to know, even as she articulated it, that the articulation would be entered in her chart as further evidence of her paranoid presentation. She wrote it anyway. That letter was in the unsealed envelope in her file. She wrote it anyway. The lobotomy was performed at Danvers by a staff physician. I'll call him Dr. Harmon, a composite figure built from the documented practices of multiple Danvers physicians of the period, because the specific institutional records for individual surgical procedures in this era are incomplete. What is historically documented is the practice. Transorbital lobotomies were performed at Danvers State Hospital through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, and the patient records consistently describe the procedure as having produced improvement in cases of severe agitation, hysteria, and what the clinical notes called management-resistant behavior. Margaret Ward underwent the procedure in September 1952. She was 39 years old. She had been at Danvers for 5.5 years. The preceding weeks, according to her file, had been marked by what the staff called an acute episode. She had refused medication for 3 consecutive days, had argued with a ward nurse, had attempted to pass a letter to a family visitor through unauthorized means. The letter was confiscated. Its contents are in her file. It reads, "Please contact the American Civil Liberties Union. My name is Margaret Ward. I am being held at Danvers State Hospital against my will. I am not mentally ill. I have been here since March 1947. Please." She had written the name of the organization correctly. She had written her own name and the date, and the institution. She had been, in September 1952, still sharp enough to know exactly what she was asking for and who to ask. The procedure was scheduled for September 17th. Dr. Harmon's note from that morning is brief. Patient prepared. Procedure performed without complication. Patient tolerated well. The duration recorded, 9 minutes. The note written 2 days later reads, "Patient calm, compliant with medication, no agitation noted, improved." I have read hundreds of clinical documents in the course of research for this channel, and I have learned to read them in a specific way, attending not to what they say, but to the gap between what they say and what they were responding to. The gap in Dr. Harmon's notes is 9 minutes wide. On one side of the 9 minutes, a woman who had spent 5 years writing letters, holding pills under her tongue, trying to get a message out, who had written the words, "I am not mentally ill," with the careful precision of someone who understood that precision was her only remaining tool. On the other side of the 9 minutes, patient calm. She spent the next 20 years at Danvers. The visitor logs show no visitors after 1952. Her file after that date contains no letters. She did not write them anymore. Staff notes describe her as cooperative, pleasant, easily managed. She worked in the laundry room. She ate her meals without incident. She walked the grounds in the afternoon when the weather permitted. She stood at windows. She looked at the east fence where the tulips came up every spring. She died at Danvers in January of 1972. The cause of death on her certificate is listed as pneumonia. She was 59 years old. The effect of a surgery performed on her brain in 9 minutes on a September morning in 1952 would have been with her for every one of the 7,100 days between that morning and the morning she died. Her brown cardboard suitcase with the broken latch was listed in the effects inventory as returned to family. Whether a family member collected it, the record does not say. The history of lobotomy at American psychiatric institutions is not, ultimately, a story about Walter Freeman, though Freeman makes a convenient focal point, and he did, without question, cause tremendous and irreversible harm. What the lobotomy represents in the institutional history of Danvers, and of the dozens of similar institutions across the country, is the endpoint of a particular logic: the logic of the machine. When Danvers became overwhelmed, when 600 beds had to serve 2,000 patients, when the farm could no longer be tended and the music rooms had become dormitories and the wide Kirkbride hallways were lined with cots, the institution's fundamental problem became management. Not treatment. Management. How do you control 2,000 people in a space designed for 600? How do you maintain the fiction of an asylum, a place of healing, when you have no mechanism of healing left? You use the tools available. And the tools available in 1952 were hydrotherapy and insulin shock, and, increasingly, the ice pick. The architecture designed to heal had become architecture of containment. The architecture of containment produced desperation. The desperation produced procedures. Each step in that sequence felt, to the people inside it, like a reasonable response to the problem immediately in front of them. That is the most important thing I can tell you about how institutions fail. They don't fail in a single dramatic moment of moral collapse. They fail in dozens of small, reasonable steps, each one making sense within the logic of the previous one, until you are 9 minutes away from an irreversible surgery on a woman who had written the words, "I am not mentally ill," the week before, and who, after the surgery, would never write those words again. The question of who was responsible. And it's a question that the surviving families of Danvers patients have asked and are still asking, is genuinely complicated by this sequence. There were bad actors. There were physicians who were careless, nurses who were cruel, administrators who prioritized institutional order over patient welfare. But the system that produced them was the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, which was the Massachusetts state government, which was the legislature, which reflected the priorities of the Massachusetts electorate, which is to say, all of us, or the version of all of us that existed in 1952, who preferred not to think too carefully about where inconvenient people went when they were made to disappear. Danvers State Hospital continued to operate through the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. The introduction of antipsychotic medications in the mid-1950s, chlorpromazine, introduced to American psychiatry in 1954, began to shift the institution's medical practices away from the more extreme physical interventions. The patient population began to decline as deinstitutionalization policies, beginning in earnest with the Community Mental Health Act of 1963, pushed the state to discharge patients to community care. The philosophy was humane, or intended to be. The execution was catastrophic in different ways, discharging tens of thousands of patients to communities that had no infrastructure to receive them. At Danvers, the patient population dropped from its 1923 peak of 2,364 to under 1,000 by 1970. The buildings emptied. The hallways that had been overcrowded for 40 years grew quiet. By the early 1980s, whole wards were closed, doors locked, windows left unrepaired. The original Kirkbride building, Bradley's building, with the high ceilings and the east-facing windows and the hallways annotated for invalid chairs, was still standing, still occupied at reduced capacity, still doing what it had always done, which was taking in the people Massachusetts didn't know what to do with. The patients who remained at Danvers through the 1970s and into the 1980s were there because deinstitutionalization had nowhere else to put them. The community mental health centers promised by the 1963 Act had been built in insufficient numbers, funded at insufficient levels, and were, by the late 1970s, failing to serve even the patients they had capacity for. The people left at Danvers were the ones who had been there longest, whose networks outside had dissolved, whose families had stopped visiting, whose lives had contracted entirely to the dimensions of the ward. Some of them had arrived as young people and were now elderly. Some of them had no memory, or no usable memory, of life outside the institution. A Danvers staff member who worked there through the 1980s told a local historian in 1995 that the late years had a particular quality to them that was different from the overcrowded decades. "It was too quiet," she said. "You'd walk a hallway that used to have 60 people in it, and there'd be 8. The old cot frames were still in the storage rooms. The paint was peeling. But the worst thing was the quiet, because those 8 people were still there, and they could hear the emptiness. And a few of them knew what the building used to be, and you could see that they knew it. 8 people in a hallway that had held 60. The cot frames in the storage rooms. The peeling paint. And 8 people in the quiet, who had been there long enough to remember the noise. The last patients were discharged in 1992. A staff member who had worked at Danvers for 31 years and who was interviewed for a local newspaper piece in September of that year said, "I know what it was. I know it wasn't always good. But it was also a place where some people lived their entire lives. And some of them were glad to be there because outside was worse. And when we closed the doors, I cried. And I'm not ashamed to say that." She had worked there for 31 years. She had known Margaret Ward. She didn't say that in the newspaper. I'm saying it now. The building sat empty for 13 years. It became famous among urban explorers. The kind of people who climb through broken windows at 3 in the morning with flashlights and come out with photographs of peeling paint and abandoned medication carts. The photographs from that period are everywhere online, and they follow a visual grammar that all abandoned institution photography follows. The decay, the wheelchair in the corner, the single shoe, the crib in the empty room. The images are designed to evoke horror, and they do evoke horror, but they also flatten what they're photographing into a single register of creepiness. The building becomes aesthetic. The people who lived in it become props for atmosphere. I have complicated feelings about those photographs. I looked at a lot of them. One of the photographers, a man who made a series of visits to the abandoned Danvers campus between 1998 and 2003, and who posted his work to an early internet photo community, later wrote about what it was like to be inside the building in that period. He described finding, in a supply room off one of the back wards, a shelf of patient files that had been left behind when the institution closed. Cardboard folders, water damaged at the edges, some of them fused together by moisture and years. He writes that he opened one. He looked at the name on the intake form, the photograph stapled to the upper corner. A woman, middle-aged, dark eyes, an expression that he described as not what I expected, which was fear. What I saw was exhaustion. Not defeat exactly. Just very deep tiredness. He closed the folder. He did not photograph it. He wrote, "I have photographed a lot of abandoned places, and I have never once felt that a building was watching me. That was the first time I felt it. Not the horror movie version. More like attention. Like the building was paying attention to whether I was going to treat what I'd found with respect." He left the folder on the shelf. I don't know if those files survived the demolition in 2007. I asked the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. They told me that patient records from Danvers State Hospital were transferred to the state archives upon closure, and that the records are partially available to qualified researchers with appropriate release authorizations. I asked about the supply room files specifically. They couldn't confirm or deny. Somewhere in the state archives, in acid-free boxes in a climate-controlled room, there may be a folder with a woman's photograph stapled to the upper corner. An expression of very deep tiredness. A name. In 2005, the Danvers State Hospital property was sold to a development company called Avalon Bay Communities. The plan was to convert the property into a mixed-use residential development, a combination of new construction apartment buildings and the conversion of the surviving original structures into luxury condominiums. The development was called, and I want you to register this carefully, Hathorne Hill, named for Judge John Hathorne, the Salem witch trials judge who had lived nearby and whose name, 3 centuries later, was apparently considered an attractive piece of branding for an upscale residential development. The conversion began in 2006. In 2007, significant portions of the original Kirkbride building, not all of it, but the rear wings, the sections that had housed the overflow wards, the sections where the cots had been lined in the hallways and the barred windows had cast their parallel shadows, were demolished. What remained was the central administration block and the front of the main building. The portion visible from the road, the portion that still looked like Bradley's drawing, that portion was converted. The high ceilings became loft apartments. The wide hallways became corridors, with recessed lighting and mounted keypad entries. The day rooms became common areas with exposed brick and pendant lighting. The east-facing windows, the windows through which morning light had moved in long rectangles across the ward floors for 114 years, the windows at which IIH, female, 34, Melancholia, had stood for 47 minutes on her first morning in 1878, the window at which Margaret Ward had watched the tulips come up every spring for 20 years. Those windows now looked out onto a landscaped courtyard with a fire pit and a grilling area. The marketing materials for the conversion described the building as a historic treasure reimagined for modern living and noted its distinctive Victorian Gothic architecture and exceptional natural light. The materials did not mention what the building had been used for or what had happened inside it. There was no legal requirement that they do so. There is still no legal requirement. In Massachusetts, as in most states, there is no obligation to disclose the history of a building to a prospective buyer. Not criminal history, not institutional history, not the fact that the previous occupants of the space were confined there against their will and subjected to treatments that the medical profession has since largely abandoned as harmful. The condominiums were priced, at their 2008 launch, between $300,000 and $650,000. The woman at the cornerstone had paid $387,000 for her unit. She came home that October evening and looked up the history. This is not a difficult thing to do. The Danvers State Hospital has a substantial historical record, a dedicated local historical society, and a well-documented Wikipedia page. Within 3 hours of standing at the cornerstone, she had read about Kirkbride, about the overcrowding, about the hydrotherapy, and the insulin shock. She had found the photographs. She sat on the kitchen floor, because the furniture wasn't unpacked yet, and she read. The granite countertops were above her. The harbor was outside the window, going dark. Somewhere in the building, another resident was cooking dinner, and she could smell it through the ventilation. Something with garlic, something warm. She read until midnight. Here is what she told me years later when I contacted her through the Danvers Historical Society. I didn't feel haunted. I want to be clear about that, because everyone always asks if I felt haunted. What I felt was accountable, which was worse, because I didn't have any choice about what had happened here. But I was choosing to stay. She did stay. She is still there. Not everyone who bought into Hathorne Hill knew what they were buying into, and not everyone who knows is bothered by it in the same way. I spoke with a resident who moved in 2011 and who told me that he found the history interesting, not upsetting, and that the building was a piece of architectural history worth preserving, which is also true. The conversion did preserve the structure. The alternative, full demolition, would have erased even the physical evidence. At least the cornerstone is still there. At least. Those two words contain a lot. The 2007 demolition of the rear wings erased the exact spaces where the worst overcrowding had occurred, where the cots had been lined in the hallways, where the hydrotherapy ward had been located. The infirmary where insulin shock therapy was administered is gone. The ward where Margaret Ward had lived for 25 years, Ward C, Building 7, is a parking structure now. The unit that was converted from the space closest to Ward C is currently listed on Zillow at $529,000. It has a renovated kitchen. Bamboo flooring. Listed as move-in ready. The Massachusetts state law that permitted involuntary commitment on the signature of a husband and a co-signing physician, the law under which Margaret Ward was committed, was not fully reformed until the Massachusetts Mental Health Reform Act of 1970, which required judicial review and independent psychiatric evaluation for all involuntary commitments. For 23 years after Margaret walked through those doors with her cardboard suitcase, that law remained on the books. For 23 of the 25 years she spent at Danvers, the mechanism that put her there was still operational. It was used during all 23 of those years. The building that Thomas Kirkbride imagined, the machine for healing, the place where broken minds could find their way back in sunlight and fresh air and the company of other people moving through beautiful spaces. That building was a genuine act of moral imagination. It deserves to be remembered as that. Kirkbride was not naive. He knew institutional care was imperfect. He knew that environment was not a complete answer to mental illness. What he argued was that environment was part of the answer, and that the people inside these institutions deserved an environment that reflected their humanity rather than their inconvenience. He was right about that. He is still right about that. The tragedy of Danvers. And I use that word carefully, because I've tried throughout this to avoid the language of drama, to let the facts carry what the facts can carry, is not that a good idea failed. Good ideas fail all the time, and their failure is usually instructive and often survivable. The tragedy is that the good idea was used as a container for its opposite. The Kirkbride building, designed to signal to patients that they were seen as human, was used instead as a legitimizing facade for practices that treated them as problems to be managed. The beautiful windows got bars on them, and the bars were put inside the beautiful windows. And the effect was something worse than a straightforward prison would have been. Because a prison doesn't promise you anything. Danvers promised healing and delivered captivity. And the people inside it. The Margarets. The women who held their pills under their tongues and wrote letters and watched for the tulips every spring. They could see the contradiction every single day. They could see the hills through the barred windows. That is a particular kind of cruelty that has its own weight. The last light of a Massachusetts October afternoon comes in low and red, and when it hits the granite face of the former administration building at what is now Hathorne Hill, the shadows in the carved letters get deep. State Lunatic Hospital, 1874. The building is 150 years old. The cornerstone has never been touched, which is either an act of historical integrity or an act of extraordinary oversight, depending on your generosity. The woman who found it that first evening told me that she sometimes pauses at it when she comes home. Not always, but sometimes. I put my hand on it, she said. I don't know why. It feels important to touch it, like acknowledging it, like saying I know. I asked her if she ever thought about who had put their hands on it before hers. She was quiet for a moment. That's the thing, she said. The cornerstone was put there so that people would know what this place was. Someone chose to carve those words into that rock, so there would be a record. And then the record got built over. And then someone moved in without knowing. And now I know. So what am I supposed to do with that? She meant it as a rhetorical question. I think she meant it as a rhetorical question. But I've been sitting with it since. There is a theory in architectural history, and I'm simplifying but not dishonestly, that buildings retain the social logic under which they were built, not in any supernatural sense, not in the ghost story sense that the Danvers State Hospital has accumulated over the decades of its abandonment, the horror films shot there, the urban explorer photographs, the Halloween tours. In a more material sense, that the physical shape of a space encodes the assumptions of the people who made it, and that you can read those assumptions in the proportions of the rooms, the placement of the windows, the width of the hallways. Bradley's hallways are still there. They are wide. You can tell, walking them, that they were designed for people to move through with dignity. The intention is still legible in the space. You can feel it. You can also feel, if you pay attention, the places where the intention was overwritten. The window frames where the bar mounts were, now plastered over but still faintly visible as slight irregularities in the molding. The places where the walls were patched when interior partitions were added to divide rooms that were too large for the number of patients who needed to sleep in them. The places where the building was forced, incrementally, to accommodate a reality it was never designed for. The building remembers what it was used for. It doesn't remember it in words or images. It remembers it in its bones. Margaret Ward remembered too, for the 9 minutes that remained of the person she had been before September 17th, 1952. What she felt in those 9 minutes, what she thought, what she saw. The ward ceiling, Dr. Harmon's face, the east window. That I cannot tell you. The clinical note doesn't say, and there was no one else writing it down. She stood at windows for 20 years after that. She watched the tulips come up every spring. She walked the hallway of Ward C, Building 7 in the afternoons, when the weather permitted, the same hallway where 5 years before she had arrived with her cardboard suitcase and told the intake nurse, "I am not sick. I am angry. Those are different things. Ward C, Building 7 is a parking structure now. Its footprint is asphalt. The tulips by the east fence," I checked because I needed to know, "are gone. The fence itself is gone. There is a retention pond where the east field used to be, built to manage stormwater runoff from the new construction. It reflects the sky, and in the morning, when the light comes from the east, it is genuinely beautiful." Nathaniel Bradley drew that view into the corner of his blueprint in 1874. The slope of grass descending to the tree line, and beyond the tree line, the suggestion of hills. He drew it because he believed the view was part of the treatment. He believed that beauty had a function. That light falling through a clean window onto a clean floor in a wide hallway was itself a kind of medicine, and that the people locked inside the worst moments of their minds deserved to look at it. He was not wrong. He was just early, and institutions are not patient with people who are early. The cornerstone is still there. The woman who lives in the building it marks has not moved. She told me, the last time we spoke, that she'd started learning the names, going through the historical records, the patient registers, the intake logs, the old newspapers. She's been doing it for 3 years now. She doesn't know yet what she'll do with the names when she has them. She said she thinks about it sometimes when she's walking the hallway at night, after the building goes quiet, when it's just her footsteps on the hardwood floors. The floors installed over the floors that were already there, the floors that Margaret Ward and E.H. and hundreds of others walked and washed and slept on and woke up on, year after year, inside the machine that was supposed to heal them. She walks the hallway. The building is quiet. The light above her comes from fixtures mounted in the original ceiling, the ceiling that Bradley specified high enough to let the bad air rise. She is walking the ward. She knows it. Some places do not become other things. They become layered. The new thing on top of the old thing. The granite countertops over the ward floor. The pendant lighting over the barred window frames. The branding of Hathorne Hill over the letters in the cornerstone that were cut deep enough that nothing built on top of them has managed to fill them in. The stone still says what it said in 1874. The stone has not been fooled. What Thomas Kirkbride understood, and what the state of Massachusetts systematically refused to understand, is that how you house a person is a statement about what you believe that person is worth. The Danvers that Bradley designed said, "This person is worth sunlight and high ceilings and a view of hills and a hallway wide enough to walk through with dignity." The Danvers of 1923, of 1952, of the year Margaret Ward's 9-minute procedure was logged as improved, said something else entirely. Said it in cots in hallways, said it in barred windows, said it in a clinical note that used the word improved to describe a woman from whom the capacity for anger had been surgically removed. The woman at the cornerstone puts her hand on the stone and says, "I know." The question she asked me is the question the building is still asking, and the tulips don't come up anymore, and the east fence is gone, and somewhere in the asphalt of the parking structure that was Ward C, Building 7, under the layer of stone and tar, and the years of cars, and the decades of forgetting, and the price of luxury condominiums in the current market, there is a floor that Margaret Ward walked every afternoon for 20 years. The same floor, the same afternoon, the same window, the same light. And she is not improved. She is just gone.